Hi everyone, me again. So let's start right at the beginning. Today is the 18th of February, so I'm getting excited because it's my birthday on Thursday, so I'm looking forward to that. There'll be more about my birthday on Thursday, so check your inboxes. Just a tip. Let's see. So this day in history, you all said that you really liked these last week, so I thought I'd drop a few more in. 18th of February in 1991, not a happy one, but the IRA exploded bombs in the early morning at Paddington Station and Victoria Station in London. The IRA, I've been doing a little bit of research, particularly with Celtic history, and of course Irish history is completely wound up in Celtic history overall. The Irish are a very interesting race, and they have been fighting for independence for a very long time. So 1991, I think the war was sort of coming to an end, but yes, that was one of these things that happened on today in history that was kind of sad. And then a few years later, this one is really interesting. I had to go and research it because I'd never heard of it before. But today in history, armed robbers stole 50 million in diamonds from a plane that was on the tarmac at Belgium airport. And the whole thing took 20 minutes. Now, if you've ever seen a heist movie like Ocean's 11 or anything like that, in the movies at the end, they have these heists that are very slick. Everything's organized. They've got it all down to a rote. They've anticipated every snag, and it just goes lickety-split. And if it's a heist movie, they usually end up walking off with whatever it is that they were trying to steal. This is what happened with this diamond heist. The whole thing took 20 minutes from start to finish. They held up the airport personnel who were loading the 50 million worth of diamonds into the plane. They had guns. They never lowered their guard whatsoever. And they took the entire 50 million worth of diamonds. The police, and it happened so fast and it was so smooth that the passengers on the plane waiting to take off didn't know anything had happened until they were told that the flight was cancelled and they had to disembark the plane. That's when they found out that something was going on. That's how slick it was. And all the authorities at the time were saying, oh, well, it has to be an inside job. And there had to be inside knowledge and stuff like that. And as it turned out, that was correct. Despite the heist itself being so slick and smooth, they made a mistake. When they were trying to fence the diamonds and sell them for the money, that's where they slipped up. And that's how the cops tracked them down. Today's 18th of February, in May of that year, they arrested 31 people involved that they thought was involved in the heist. They ended up laying charges on 19 of the people that they arrested. But another interesting fact about this one is not all the diamonds were ever recovered. They only got a small fraction of them back. So someone somewhere got away with an awful lot of money that day. Also, it's not really in history, but today is Family Day in Alberta. So it's a long weekend here, and I can actually hear people walking around upstairs at the moment because the house is full. Everyone's off work today. Long weekends. So let's have a look at comments. Karen, hello. Hi, nice to see you here. And Sandy, hello. Ava, and hello, Ava. Ava asks, what mistake did they make? I don't know, Ava. The documentation, as far as I researched, didn't exactly say. I get the impression it's something to do with the fence that they tried to sell the diamonds to. Either he gave them up or he was sloppy. That actually sounds more reasonable to me, that someone outside their immediate heist gang was the one that screwed up, because their side of it was just so slick. a little bit of research might reveal the answer, or it might be enclosed in official records and you'll never find out. But apparently there were mistakes made, and that's how the police finally tracked them down, just because they made mistakes. If they hadn't, they might still be sitting on the 50 million. Audrey, hello. Hi. And yes, President's Day in the United States, of course. I should remember that because it's February. And Pat has arrived. Hello, Pat. So let's go have a look at, I got some mail this week. I mean, I get mail every week, but I got some really interesting ones this week, so I thought I would mention them. Dina, who is a street team member and usually comes to the Facebook Lives. She had surgery recently and has been having all sorts of pain issues and recovery issues. Wanted me to say hello to everyone and say she's sorry she can't be here live. So I'm passing that along as requested. Also, and it's entirely possible Dina might still turn up, but we'll see. I know she has issues getting online. Some people do. And I also had an email from Mike, which I'm going to have to read. Over time, I seem to have acquired 3 books named Forbidden. One was written by Anastasia Black, but my notes say something about a Russian count and violence, and I didn't give it a very good rating. Then there is one I bought on All Romance by you, and eventually I picked up a free copy on Amazon of the same name. Those, however, had good ratings. Hey! And the last 2 were the same book. Anyway, I did, of course, respond to Mike directly, but I wanted to touch on that one. Yes, Anastasia Black, if you happen to trip over this yourself, Anastasia Black was the name that Julia Templeton and I had to use for the first edition of the book. We were told that our names were too long and they couldn't get both of them on the cover, so we had to use pen name. So we came up with Anastasia Black, which was just as long, but it was only the one name. So when we first published on Alora's Cave in 2003, it came out under the Anastasia Black pen name. Come along to 2011, and I went indie and got all my rights back, including the rights for Forbidden and the second book in the series, which is Dangerous Beauty. This is the Scandalous Sirens series, the first series. So it's entirely possible that you may find old copies out there that have got the Anastasia Black pen name on. Yes, it's the same book. However, Mike was talking about a book that had a Russian count in it, which I can assure you Forbidden does not have. So possibly what has happened there is, and I mean this happens and I'm not judging anything, just bear that in mind, but a lot of the bootleg sites and the phishing sites will grab any crappy novel anywhere, it doesn't matter, whatever they can get their hands on, and then they'll slap the cover of a best-selling book on it, and in that way they can get your, in order for you to download the bootleg copy, usually you have to hand over your email address and your name, and sometimes even more than that. But it's a form of phishing. It's or it could be that the crappy book that they've got underneath the cover has got a virus or something like that in it. So quite often what you think is the very popular book, the good book, is actually not that book at all. And that's one of the problems with bootleg sites. You never know what you're going to get. So I suspect that's what's happened with Mike's first book, because I have never written about a Russian count. So, and one last email I got from Anna, and actually this happened just a few minutes ago on Facebook. I got a Facebook Live message, and Anna said, "I've just watched your broadcast from last week. It was very interesting. Just one minor hiccup. Henry VIII broke from Rome and established the Church of England so that he could divorce Catherine of Aragon and not Anne Boleyn," which is actually correct. He created the Church of England so he could marry Anne Boleyn and get rid of Catherine. So I kind of mixed that up. For me, Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII are kind of joined at the hip. I forgot about Catherine of Aragon, but yes, that's who he was trying to divorce, not Anne Boleyn. So just keep that one in mind. Let's have a look here. Karen is workday in Oz. Sorry, but I mean, you just got Australia Day, so. Anna, and there's Anna. Hello. Hello, Anna. And Marin Catalan. Hello, Marin. I think I don't remember seeing your name here before, but hello and welcome. Anna, I hope she gets better soon. Speedy recovery to her. That's Dina, yes. And I'm sure she appreciates it too. Thank you, Anna. And Ava too, wishing a speedy recovery to Dina and Karen and Audrey. And there's Heather. Hello, Heather in the Highlands. And Heather says hello, Dina too. Yes. Okay. All right. So I wanted to bring you up to date on, there is a ton of giveaways going on at the moment. So I just wanted to make sure, particularly for those of you that are watching the replay, but even those of you that are watching live, here's a way to check and make sure that you haven't missed out on any of the giveaways. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 going on at the moment. Number 1 is the science fiction space opera giveaway on BookFunnel, and I have Faring Soul in that one. So if you'd like to pick up a copy, backtrack through your emails and see if you can find it. Also, the Valentine Hot and Steamy. I've got the 2 books in that one. I've got Kiss Across Time and Soul of Sin. So there's that one. And number 3 is another science fiction / fantasy. And in that one, I'm giving away a copy of Grayson's Doom, which is the first book in the Endurance series. That's the Generation ship. So good space opera stuff. The 4th one is the Romantic Fantasy giveaway. That one's a little bit different. I don't have huge amounts of romantic fantasy, although now with the Once and Future King series, that technically is a romantic fantasy. And you'll actually, by the end of today, you'll understand why I'm saying that. But I do have the first 10 chapters of the Branded Rose prophecy in that one. Now, that sounds like a lot, but Branded Rose is like, 250, 260,000 words. It's huge. I think it's 450 pages or something like that. It's massive. And that 450 pages is using tiny, tiny little text. It's a big book. But anyway, you can get the first 10 chapters in that one. And then the final one is the Come Back to the Past historical fiction giveaway, and I've got Chronicles of the Lost Years in that one. So if you want to pick up a copy of Sherlock Holmes romantic mystery, there you go. So let me just check comments again. Janita, hi, hello. Sandy, oh, Sandy, you're looking forward to surgery as well. Oh dear. Okay, well, good luck with that, Sandy. I hope that goes well. Okay, so let's get on with this one. I'm just going to scroll this up here, and we're talking about today kings, and more kings, or kings over kings and high kings. Now, let me just work my way. Now, I'm going to have to check my notes here because this is really complicated, believe it or not. I've been doing a lot of research on Celts for the Once and Future Hearts series. Oh, I mean, that makes sense, right? Because it's King Arthur and stuff like that. And King Arthur, the Celts were controlling most of Britain when King Arthur was supposed to be around. So one presumes that King Arthur would have been a Celt. It's not likely that he would have been any other tribe or race. He would have been Celt because the Romans were gone. There's a lot of authors, modern authors, who've tried to propose that King Arthur was in fact a Roman. And I think the Clive Owen movie of King Arthur, that's what they did, was they made him a Roman leading these weird warriors from Europe which didn't make sense to me at all. But don't let me get started on that particular movie, because that one I find really offensive when it comes to how they treated the history. But anyway, so I think most often, particularly with the King Arthur mythology, they quite often talk about like first families and Roman families and stuff like that. But the Romans that were in Britain when the Roman legions pulled out, which is in 409, I think. Yeah, I think it was very early in the 5th century. I can't remember my dates right now, but it was somewhere around about there. But when they left, it's not like everyone who was Roman picked up and left with them. It's because the Romans had been in Britain for over a century. Basically what happened was the native Britons, the Celts, became naturalized Romans, so to speak. They took on the Roman lifestyle. I mean, there was a lot about the Roman lifestyle that was good. They had plumbing, they had aqueducts, running water, flushing toilets, dentistry. Rome was very high tech and had really advanced culture. So the Brits just took all that on and went, right, I'm Roman, because they all became Roman citizens under the Roman rule. So they took the best of the Roman culture and kept it. So all the British leaders that were left when the Roman legions pulled out were actually native Britons, Celts. But they called themselves Romans. So I think a lot of the history gets mixed up because of that fact. And the leading families of the time that were left when the legions left thought of themselves as patrician Roman families. So there is always this trace of Roman culture that you find in the Celts after the Romans left. So keep that in mind for a minute, because that's important. Now, let's look at just the Celts on their own. If you've read any King Arthur stuff at all, or seen any of the better movies, you've probably noticed that there are a lot of kings running around in the mythology. There's King Mark, there's King Arthur, there's King Pellinore. Off the top of my head, I can't remember all the names, but it seemed like every companion of Arthur was a king. But all these kings are obeying Arthur, who was a king himself. So, I mean, how do you figure all that out? And here's where the research came up with the really interesting things. The kings, there were a lot of kings in Celtic culture, even prior to the Romans arriving. And those kings it was really just a title to indicate someone who was controlling the land for the people that lived on it. And their word for king actually implies reaching. So a king was sort of like overreaching. He was over the top of those people. And to begin with the Celts, the king wasn't a warrior. He was a peaceful leader, a politician that influenced for the good of his people. And here's the really interesting thing with the Celts. Their kings were not, they were not inherited titles. The first son did not automatically become the king after the king died. They decided who would be king based on who would be best for the role, which is really interesting. Quite often they would decide before the current king died who would take his place, and it was based on who was the strongest, who was the best leader, and it usually ended up being one of the people in and around that king. So even the previous generation, his generation, so it could be his brother or a cousin, or the next generation. So it could be a son, it could be a nephew, something like that. And all those three generations, so his previous generation, the king's generation, and his next generation, those people in that direct family were the ones who decided who should become the next king. It had nothing to do with who his sons were or anything like that. It was just who was going to be the best king. So that's why you find some really interesting stories in King Arthur where there's like two brothers ruling. They're having double kings, like two brothers ruling at the same time. is actually a historical fact. There are a lot of two brothers ruling in Irish history, for example, because Ireland has got written records going back for ages and ages and ages. The other important thing about kings in those stages too, particularly before the Romans came along, the kings were considered part of the land. So if the land failed, so did the king. If the king failed, so did the land. And this quite often was because the king was the one who controlled harvesting and what land they were going to farm. And he made a lot of decisions like that on behalf of the people, particularly because the tribes were quite mobile before the Romans came along. So quite often the decisions he made had a huge impact on the survival rate of the tribe. So his connection with the land became stronger and stronger. And that is something that you may have noticed if you read Dragonkin. And the whole story hinged on the fact that Aron, who was the king of Broceliande, was facing a drought that had lasted for years and years and years. And it was up to him to break the drought by his actions. And that's where that story came from, was this idea that the king was like joined at the hip with the land that he ruled. And if he flourished, so did the land. And usually that was the case in those days. But that's where you can see where the mythology starts to evolve, and it becomes very mysterious and myth-based. And it's also how, when they started to crown their kings, the coronation was very mysterious and spiritual based. It was uniting the king with his land so that both of them would flourish or fail. I mean, everyone hoped he would flourish, but the actual coronation was a ceremony that joined them together. Now, as I was saying, originally the kings were political leaders, the best person for the job, who was strong and could lead properly. And they know that because the original burial barrows and mounds that they've uncovered archaeologically, the very, very early ones didn't have weapons or anything like that in it. Towards the Roman times, the older barrows, they started finding weapons and war chariots and things like that. So there was a shift over time, so that the leaders, the Celtic leaders, the kings, were starting to be chosen because they were strong warriors, which shows that there was a shift in Britain from just being farmers and having a nice, stable, peaceful life to one where war was a major criteria. It was a major problem for them. And if you look at the history, you can see that they were invaded over and over again. So suddenly someone who could lead their people in times of war was the best person to be king. So there was a shift to war leaders as opposed to just kings who led their people successfully. And so invaders, they had Rome who came in. Rome kind of slammed them. And here's the interesting thing. It was not the first time that Rome had invaded. Rome came in the 5th century, very early 5th century. They had been there before, 250 years ago, and were repelled by the Celts. The Celts fought them off, and they gave up. It was actually Julius Caesar at the time. He tried twice in a couple of years, and he ended up turning back, going home, and leaving them alone. There were also the Picts to the north that they were fighting off. And of course, later on, during King Arthur's time, the Saxons, who eventually succeeded. But we're still just talking about Celts and their kings at the moment. Here's another interesting fact about the Celts. Their women leaders were considered just as strong and just as suitable. So there were women leaders, although it wasn't common. Strong women leaders were obeyed and followed as easily as the men were. And the perfect example, of course, is Boadicea, or Boudica, depending on which language you're actually translating that into. She actually told Julius Caesar, "I am not the first Celtic woman to lead her people to war." It's a very famous quote, and she was speaking quite truthfully too. So that is another thing that you actually see coming through in the King Arthur mythology, is you see a lot of queens running around doing things. And this is distinctly different from medieval times, when the queen was basically a wallflower that sat on the second throne and did nothing but produce heirs for the king. The medieval structure and the medieval social culture was very, very different to the Celtic one. And that is a problem that you get all through the Arthurian myth. And this is something that I had to deal with, because when you start looking at King Arthur stories, the very earliest ones were just collected tales that have been passed down mouth to mouth for generations, and were finally written down in the 8th century or the 9th century, depending on who you're looking at. So those very earliest tales were all tales about Celtic tribes and their war leaders, their kings. And of course, as king was just a title for somebody who controlled people, they would have kings that were controlling tribes, and they would have kings that were controlling groups of tribes. They became over-kings. And then they had a leader who was leading all of the tribes. When suddenly they were faced with these massive island-wide invasions from the Romans and from the Saxons, they needed someone, one person, to direct all of the tribes and all of the over-kings in the war effort. So they would have a high king. And this is where all these kings and over-kings and high kings and all the kings and queens that run around in King Arthur stories, this is where they came from. There actually were dozens and dozens of kings. But it gets tripped up too, because a lot of the King Arthur stories that we know from modern times actually came down from the medieval period. You know, as soon as you get into Norman culture, things shift. And here's a famous example. Everyone's heard of the Duke of Cornwall. He was Igraine's husband before Uther took her, and well, he killed the Duke first and then took her for his queen. Now, in Celtic times, there was no such thing as a duke. It was a Norman title. It came in the medieval period from Europe, but everyone knows the Duke of Cornwall. It's a famous name in King Arthur mythology. So while I'm trying to keep the Once and Future Hearts series as pure and abiding by its roots as possible, what do I do with the Duke of Cornwall, who, if I don't call him the Duke of Cornwall and doesn't appear in the story, everyone's going to throw up their hands and say, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. He's the Duke of Cornwall. So I ended up making a lot of compromises. The Duke of Cornwall is there because everyone knows his name. Same with Lancelot. Lancelot is there even though he is a French medieval character. He didn't turn up until then. King Arthur did have friends in earlier versions. Bedivere is one of the earliest ones that was always there. But everyone knows Lancelot. Lancelot is just, you can't tell a King Arthur story without including Lancelot. So I sort of threw up my hands and went, okay, we're going to have Lancelot as well. So Lancelot is in there as well. So I had to make a lot of compromises. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere is also a medieval invention. But it's so wrapped up in King Arthur and so well known that you just can't avoid it. You have to put it in. But let me just get back to my notes for a second. And yeah, so, and the other thing, that was the other thing too. The medieval stories, the romance cycles, there was the French one and there was the British one. They had the kings not really doing much, and they were all supporting King Arthur. They were all hanging around Camelot and sleeping in pavilions and wooing ladies and fighting dragons and things like that. Meantime, what's happening with the land at home? This one has really bothered me, because it seems to me that if they're fighting to defend Britain, okay, they would be with King Arthur, but who's watching the home front while they're doing that? So you'll find when you get to read War Duke of Britain, I try to answer that. And when you do get to read High King of Britain, I deal with that even more, because it's an issue that needs to be dealt with if you're writing a realistic story. And I don't have dragons in my story. There's not a lot of magic, but I couldn't avoid it entirely because it's almost impossible to tell a King Arthur story without including some magic in there. But I keep it as minimal as I can. So there you go. That's why there are kings running all over the place in King Arthur stories, and why they're not off taking care of their kingdoms, because of the times and the places, and because of the Celtic structure, politics, and the structure of their communities. I mean, they were originally tribes that moved around, and eventually, as they settled down under Roman influence, they became kingdoms. So that's where all the kings come from. So let's have a look at comments. Anna, that's the problem with these American films. Once they are made, people will think it is real history. I get very annoyed about things like that. Yeah, it depends on whether you know the history or not, Anna. A lot of people just aren't interested in history. They just want an entertaining story. So if you watch the latest King Arthur story with Charlie Hunnam, I think that's his name, that history was completely screwed up too. But if you can forget that you're actually watching a King Arthur story and just watch it for its own sake, it's actually quite an entertaining movie. And Charlie Hunnam is not entirely difficult to watch anyway. He made a pretty good King Arthur. So Dina is here. Hello, Dina. You made it. Well done. I hope you're feeling better. Well, I was just telling everyone about the surgery that you've been going through. So Anna, lots of tribes at that time. Yes, there was. And they later settled and established themselves as kingdoms, which is Karen, similar to tribal chiefs. Yes, the kings were basically the equivalent of a tribal chief. They started off just being leaders, and then they became warriors. So Heather sounds familiar. Okay. Anna T.H. White's Once and Future King comes to mind. I love that book. So did I. I loved Lancelot and Guinevere in that one. They're sweet. So Boadicea was the most famous. Yes, she was. Lancelot is an integral part of the Arthurian legends. Everyone knows that. Yes. That's what I was saying. You can't tell a King Arthur story without including Lancelot, even though he didn't actually show up in the mythology until medieval times. But it's just impossible. You can't tell an authentic King Arthur story without putting those in there. It would just not be the same sort of story. So Anna, their stewards and servants would take care of everything. Actually, the kings really didn't have lots of stewards and servants. Bedivere was considered Kay was King Arthur's steward, but that's actually a medieval term. In Celtic culture, it was a very flat structure. There was sort of the leader, but he was considered first among equals, among all the strong men of the tribe, and the women too. I mean, women were completely equal. There was none of this they were allowed to, Celtic women, now that's another subject, and I'll get onto that another time, but just very quickly, the Celtic women were allowed to have property. When they got married, they brought that property into the marriage. If they got divorced, they could keep the property. It's not like they just had this dowry that came along with them. They were free to be warriors if they wanted to. They could get an education. They were considered equals in all ways to men, except for even from a strength point of view, they would learn to fight and compensate for the weight and strength and lack of upper body strength. But I'll do a thing on Celtic women another time, because that's a really interesting one. So, but to get back to Anna's comment, stewards and servants, they didn't actually have a lot of stewards and servants in Celtic times, particularly before the Romans came along. They did, however, have slaves. But even that was dying off before the Romans left. The Romans really brought in the slaves and stuff like that. But for a long while, the British people, the Celts, were the Roman servants. And then gradually there were strong leaders and families, greater families that rose up in the Roman structure in Britain and became the leading families. It's complex, but servants were not really a big thing for them. They did have slaves, but mostly it was the people, the workers, who did all the work. So, Ava, there's a lot of history according to Hollywood that we teachers have a hard time overcoming. I'm quite sure, Ava. Anna, that is my point precisely, that most people have no deeper knowledge of history, therefore they take all kinds of rubbish at face value. Yes, and that's quite true, Anna. Anna, Kay was also Arthur's foster brother as well. Yes, he was. Kay was the son of Sir Ector. And that's another thing too, the knights and the sirs, Sir Galahad and Sir Ector and stuff like that, purely medieval. I won't be using Sir in the series, and I won't be using knights per se. I will have instead Arthur's companions. He had 12 companions. So those 12 people will be his lieutenants, his major officers that he uses when he goes to war. Sandy, that's what I like about the Celts, very egalitarian. Yes, they are. It's fascinating if you can get hold of a recent book and research just what the Celtic culture was like. Really interesting. I sometimes think we really lost out, we women, when the Normans invaded Britain, or even when the Anglo-Saxons invaded Britain. We kind of lost the deal there. So, Anna, for us, the Arthurian legends really connect to the Middle Ages. Yes, they do, but you can also see that the Celtic roots in there as well. And I find it really hard to talk about knights in plate armor in the 5th century. It makes me break out in hives to even think of doing that. So as much as possible, I'm sticking with the Celtic roots of the Arthurian mythology and trying to, anything that's really obviously medieval, I'm just throwing off. Obviously, of course, I'm keeping Lancelot and people like that in there. And but like I said, I'm getting rid of the knights and I'm not using sirs and titles like that. I'm kind of stuck with the Duke of Cornwall because he's such an essential part of the Arthurian mythology. Same with Lancelot, although I don't consider it being stuck with him because he and Guinevere are such a delicious part of the history. So I'll leave those ones in there, I think. Anyway, any more questions? So did I answer everyone's curiosity about why there are so many kings running around? In the meantime, we're on the countdown to the release of the War Duke of Britain. That's early next month, and I think next week we get the first chapter. So if you haven't had a chance yet, you might want to check out the series, especially if you've enjoyed anything that I've said, or if it's tickled your curiosity. Do have a look at the series and maybe pick up the first book, which is Born of No Man. Other than that, I don't have any more comments here, I don't think. Oops. So Anna, the Knights of the Round Table and Camelot, etc. is all medieval. Yes, it is. Technically, there was a Celtic chieftain who was Arthur, but the Arthurian legends per se are connected to later years, 12th to 13th century, I believe. Actually, no, they were built upon the writings of Nennius and Bede, the Venerable Bede, who both wrote about the Celtic kings. The medieval people like Geoffrey of Monmouth actually picked up copies of those and expanded on them, and of course brought all their contemporary standards to the stories, and their inventions were of course medieval. So that's the King Arthur mythology. You have to sort of pick very carefully between what's medieval and what's more ancient Celtic roots. And in medieval times, there would not have been all these kings running around. There was one king, that was it. He was the one that ruled the entire country. So that's where I started off with, well, okay, why are all these kings running around? And that's where I got into the Celtic roots. So even though most of what we know about King Arthur comes from the medieval stories, those medieval stories are based upon the original sub-Roman Celtic mythology, which was only recorded by 2 or 3 people. And even those people were recording verbal tales that they had learned 200 years after King Arthur was supposed to be around. And that's why there's just, nobody's really sure of what the true history was. But it's fascinating trying to unravel it. Audrey, as always, I appreciate the history that you explain. No problems, Audrey. You're welcome. Sandy, Pinterest has a lot of good boards on Celtic clothing warriors and houses if you want to see pictures. Just one proviso on that, Sandy. A lot of the Celtic information that we have is prior to the Roman occupation of Britain or the Roman occupation of Europe. So, and because once the Romans had left Britain, which is the King Arthur period that I'm kind of interested in, it's called sub-Roman, because the Celts were so influenced by Roman culture, there's distinct changes. And just one, for instance, is before the Romans came, they all lived in round houses. In Britain in particular, it was very common. But after the Romans left, they still continued to live in square buildings built in the Roman fashion. In fact, some of the biggest archaeological finds are from the sub-Roman period, and the archaeologists for the longest time were really confused because as far as they were concerned, the Romans had left by that time. But here they were with these big, big Roman buildings, Roman-style buildings that they had discovered that belonged to the 4th and the 5th century, 5th and 6th centuries. And what it was the Celts and the native Britons who'd been left behind when the Romans pulled out continued to live the way that they had grown up with. So they kept building Roman-style houses. So the Celtic culture prior to Rome is fascinating all on its own, but you have to make that adjustment if you're looking at sub-Roman, because they would have taken on the best of the Roman culture and kept it and kept going with it. So venerable. Venerable means old. Basically, he was a really old man when he wrote. So old and wise, I think, is the pure definition. Anna, the whole chivalric behavior is more characteristic of the Middle Ages than pre-Roman Roman times. Yes, it is, but no, it's not either. The Celts in particular the Celts were very, very honourable in their own right. It wasn't just a medieval invention, although the medieval knights and chivalry and all that were plastered on top of it. And I actually suspect this is why the Celtic mythology was picked up by the medieval authors, because the Celts had a very strong honour-based system. Their laws involved fines for everything. If a man shot an arrow and accidentally shot a cow, he was fined and had to make reparations for that cow to the owner of the cow. That's just the simple thing. Because the Saxons invaded Rome very early on in the Roman Empire, and rather than just start a war, their strongest warrior stepped out and challenged the Romans to one-on-one combat. Now, he was willing, and the Celts were willing, that if they lost that battle, they would consider the war done. The Romans, who kind of laughed and considered the Celts barbarians, accepted the offer, sent out a warrior, and they did win the fight, and the Celts were going to go home. The Celts said, okay, that's it, we're done, we've honor has been met, we'll just go home. The Romans turned around and started fighting. So there was this clash of cultures and misunderstandings and stuff like that. But all throughout Celtic history, there is this honor system that you can see. There's laws and there's honorable ways of fighting and things like that, that the Romans kind of dismantled. But I suspect that's why the medieval authors focused in on this Celtic mythology, because of these standards and rules and so on and so forth. So the Celts had their own chivalry. It just wasn't called chivalry. So Sandy, sorry, yes, you're right. I meant the transition period. Didn't know it was called Sub-Roman. Actually, it was called Dark Ages for the longest time, Sandy, because they figured that nothing happened there. It was complete chaos. There was no leadership. Archaeology is starting to uncover the fact that actually, no, there was a thriving community post-Roman, or sub-Roman, as it's called. So, and more as they're uncovering stuff, they're starting to learn that it didn't just all fall in a heap. There actually was a community that the native Britons basically took back Britain until the Saxons invaded. And Sandy, yes, it has been called the Dark Ages. But Dark Ages is it's considered not quite politically correct anymore. It's more correct to call it sub-Roman, because Dark Ages imply it's a negative connotation, whereas sub-Roman just means it's a different era. So, bye, Karen. So yes, if there's nothing else, I think we'll call it a day for this week. Sandy, brilliant culture and jewelry. Yes. And the Celts, of course, were the ones that started wearing tartan first. Not the northern tribes in Scotland, of course, adopted it and increased it later on in medieval times. But to start with, it was the Celts that were wearing it. Okay, I think, yes. All right. So I think we'll call it a halt there, and I have to go get a glass of water. I've been talking too much. See you all next week. And in the meantime, don't forget, you can always email me if you've got any questions. And so I'll see you next week then.